you know, it was really an amazing place. And Carol Stocking, many of you may remember, who was really a significant part of the center for years. Is it? Okay. So clinical ethics really moved from the analysis of ethical dilemmas from the realm of theory to the bedside, as I said. And this is from U.S. News and World Report that ranked clinical ethics programs from 1991, 92, 93, and the University of Chicago was #1 all of those years. And again, the focus in those days was novel questions, creative answers, and it really shifted ethics to a central role in patient care, rather than it being an esoteric thing that some people talked about that was theory. It was actually practice. So what fits in medical ethics, and how do I view that today? Well, I think that certainly the doctor and patient are important, and this is sort of early on, that was the focus of clinical ethics. I think that over time it became clear that it isn't just the doctor and the patient, but they interact within a family context. And so it is a broader view of what this encounter is. And obviously, we know that healthcare involves many other caregivers. So nurses, therapists, social workers, medical assistant, technicians, many people are responsible for providing the care that our patients receive today. Furthermore, it's clear that healthcare occurs in a health system within a society. And that means that clinical interactions cannot be isolated from the system in which they occur. And if we have learned nothing from COVID, I think we ought to have learned that these things are very central, and that we cannot take a very narrow view of clinical ethics. And furthermore, I would say healthcare actually takes place in a global community. And so in that sense, thinking about clinical ethics on this much broader global scheme, I think is something that we need to do in order to be relevant in the future. Now, not only do interactions of patients and their caregivers, that's important, but implications of research on clinical care, that's significant for clinical ethics. Disparities in outcomes and access, as you'll hear today, how ought scarce resources be allocated equitably? These are central questions that I think are certainly relevant to clinical ethics. How will future developments in genetics, AI impact patient care? All of these things are practical clinical ethics issues. Now, I just want to share with you in the last couple minutes a few future directions for the center. We want to continue the important role in educating future clinicians. We want to provide mission-critical ethics consultations for the medical center, increase the empirical research to inform optimal approaches to patient care. When you think about the MacLean Center and the University of Chicago, we need to cultivate greater interdisciplinary collaboration across the university. We need to highlight the implications of public policy on patient care. I think that there are many people that work in public policy that don't actually see how those choices translate into what happens when we care for patients. We need to engage the surrounding community to improve patient trust in our institution. I think that should be a role that the MacLean Center plays. I think that we've got to leverage the new cancer hospital to address ethical issues in clinical trials. We need to improve the outcomes of cancer patients by attending to the ethical dimension of patient care. We need to improve access to novel treatments by increasing the diversity of clinical trial participation. I think we need to use the challenges of the trauma center as an opportunity. The tragedy of the trauma center is that it's an incredibly busy trauma center. You'll hear from Dr. Rogers shortly, but that's an opportunity for us. We need to explore communication and trust issues in dire emergencies. I think it's different when you tell a patient your loved one just died unexpectedly, it's unfathomable. And there's nothing, you can't say, and the next steps in the treatment will be this and this and this. It's totally different. I think that we need to assess strategies to mitigate the impact of trauma on patients and on their caregivers. And I think these are things that the center can partner with other groups like the trauma program. I think we need to increase the impact of ethics scholarship. And many of you know the Journal of Clinical Ethics has been acquired by the University of Chicago Press, and we are the sponsoring institution. And so for everyone who's giving a talk today, I would encourage you to submit your manuscript to the Journal of Clinical Ethics. We're going to work on increasing grant funding. I think we need to build a greater community among MacLean faculty to encourage scholarly collaboration. There's an incredible amount of talent within the faculty of the MacLean Center, but unfortunately, we don't always work together as well as we could. I think we need to support faculty in submitting these competitive grants for external funding, and we need to establish empirical bioethics research core to support these studies. The MacLean Prize is going to be given out tomorrow to Dr. Wendy Levinson. You'll hear all about that. I think we want to change that for next year. We want to increase the national and international prominence by an open call for nominations. So you'll be hearing more about that. I will encourage you, if you know folks who are deserving at other institutions, to think about that. It's on our website, the call for nominations, and the nomination deadline is May 1. We're going to change the MacLean Conference for next year. I won't go into this in detail, but we're going to shift to a national clinical ethics conference. We'll have blinded abstract review, submission of manuscripts to the Journal of Clinical Ethics. It's hard to read this, but it's on the website. Abstract submission site opens on March 1st, and the deadline for abstract submission is April 15th. So that means I encourage all of you and everyone who's been associated with the MacLean Center, but others who are doing important work in clinical ethics, to broaden the conversation. Because I do think that we want to ensure that it's not just us talking to ourselves. We don't want this to be an echo chamber. We really want to broaden the conversation. So there are possible international collaborations, potential for joint programming and increasing interactions in a cross-cultural manner. And I have a significant interest from Peking Union Medical College and the University of Buenos Aires. So with that, I'm going to end with 3 thoughts. I do think we need to continue to build on the tradition of the MacLean Center. I think it's a wonderful tradition, but we have to bring it forward into the future. We have to broadly define that clinical ethics includes ethical issues in healthcare delivery, research, and in policy. And I think that we want to lead in the development of scholarship in clinical ethics through the broad engagement of faculty and fellows, because that's been the strength of the MacLean Center for years. So with that, I'm going to end. There's no time for questions for me because I went over. But I want to introduce the moderator of the first session, Dr. Marshall Chin, who is the Richard Perillo Family Distinguished Service Professor of Healthcare Ethics at the University of Chicago. Marshall is an associate director of the MacLean Center. He's been involved nationally in multiple programs to increase access to care and to mitigate the disparities in care and access. I could go on and on about Marshall. He's really a wonderful colleague who we value tremendously, but I don't want to take time from his panel. So Marshall, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peter. So I'll be moderating this first panel on health policy and health disparities. As Peter mentioned, 20 minutes per speaker, so probably roughly 15 minutes of speaking and 5 minutes Q&A. I will just very briefly introduce each speaker to allow more time for Q&A. And so turns out I am the first speaker. And I'm actually going to talk about introduce you to some of the work of a political philosopher named Judith Sklar, talking about the liberalism of fear, prevention of cruelty, and advancing health equity. And I'll start with a story that one of my patients is a retired University of Chicago social scientist professor. And when I saw him in January this year for an appointment, I asked him, well, how do you think our country is doing? And he said, Marshall, to be honest with you, I am very concerned. I'm concerned about income inequality. I'm concerned about the lack of action on global climate change. And then I am fearful that we need to have two sane political parties in our country for us to survive. And so I thought a lot about what he said. And so 3 days ago, we had the election. And so again, sort of a very divided country. And so back in 2021, Sabrina Tavernise, she wrote in the New York Times an article about Enid, Oklahoma. She talked about the division in America, and she talked about the difficult conflict being driven by powerful human emotions like the fear of not belonging, the sting of humiliation, a sense of threat, real or perceived, and the strong pull of group behavior. So much of my work, as Peter mentioned, involves trying to advance health equity. And one thing that we've learned is that culture is really important, that culture matters for advancing health equity. One of our most recent papers published in Academic Medicine talked about the University of Chicago Medicine's journey over the past 10 years on diversity, equity, inclusion. And we talked about the importance of understanding systems of power, systems of oppression, both within and outside the institution, as well as the importance of how we relate to one another within the institution, as well as with the community. This is a slide I typically use on many of my equity talks. The far right of the slide is what I would call the more technical aspects. So for example, I spend a lot of time now thinking about how we can reform payment to advance health equity. Monica Pico, who you hear about more a little bit later, we spend a lot of time thinking about cross-sector partnerships across healthcare and the social sectors to advance health equity. You see at the very top, as well as the far left, that in some ways is the cultural part. That first, this is an important mission, that all this is for naught unless everyone is truly committed to advancing health equity. And then again, that far left part, this thing about the culture of equity, that unless there's a culture of equity, you do all the wonderful technical things in the world, but you're actually not going to be successful with implementation. So I think culture is very, very important. So again, thinking about this conversation with my patient, it made me think about, well, for those of us trying to advance health equity, being thoughtful about, well, where are the opportunities where we can engage in dialogue and trying to bridge barriers and come up with good relations and move forward, versus at times there may be chasms which are just too wide to be able to approach, at least in the short term, and where policy action and legal action are necessary, these type of safeguards. Which raises the question, what should be our national moral compass? And how should the national moral compass relate to the actions of individuals, the legal system, and government? Which takes us to Judith Sklar. So Judith Sklar was an amazing person. She was the first professor of government at Harvard who was a woman. So really sort of a trailblazer. She was one of the best teachers I've ever had. And my sophomore year, I took this course, Historical Studies A17, Modern Political Ideologies. And it was a tough course that had a lot of the government majors. We read the original text. It was like the whirlwind survey tour of the various isms. So we read Edmund Burke, we read John Stuart Mill on Liberty, we read Michelet for populism, we read a lot of Marx, we read Mein Kampf by Hitler. And Professor Sklar was amazing in terms of being able to both elucidate the particular political ideologies, as well as put them within their own historical context. We read a lot of history for this also, as well as then relating them to the relevance for the modern world. So it's amazing in terms of an integrative scholar. So she passed away in 1992, so 30 years ago. And there's been a resurgence in Judith Sklar. There's been a lot now books written about her work. And this is a paper from 2018, because what she's talking about is just so highly relevant, as you'll see with like the issues we're facing both domestically as well as globally. And so it wasn't until like way later that I learned more about her life that she was from Latvia. So she was a Jewish background, Jewish Latvian refugee and immigrant that she came over in the late 1930s. So she just escaped the twin pillars of Nazism on the far right and Stalinism on the far left. The circuitous really was Japan, then Canada, then eventually the US. But I think what makes her unusual is that she's an amazing thinker. And then she has the real world live experience where, you know, she is lucky she survived. And when she passed away, one of our colleagues at Harvard in the government department, Stanley Hoffman, wrote a very nice sort of essay about her. And he wrote that those who knew Dita Sklar were sometimes warmed, occasionally scorched, and always dazzled by her radiance. The world is a much drabber and grimmer place without her incisive intelligence, her rapier-like mind, her colossal energy, her incredible all-encompassing erudition, her limitless curiosity, her impatience with false pretense, the enthusiasm with which she read, wrote, taught, and inspired. She once wrote that there are two kinds of political scientists: those who study power because they like to exert it, and those who study it because they fear it. Those who would like to ride the horse of power, and those who are scared of being trampled by it. So I'm going to share with you perhaps her most famous finding in philosophy, the so-called liberalism of fear and the prevention of cruelty. And the basic idea is actually quite simple, that Dr. Sklar thought that cruelty is the worst sin. She defines cruelty as the willful inflicting of physical pain on a weaker being in order to cause anguish and fear. And she thought that if you use that as the fundamental principle for organizing your society, you could do pretty well. She says that by putting cruelty unconditionally first, with nothing above us to excuse or forgive acts of cruelty, one closes off any appeal to any order than that of actuality. To put cruelty first, therefore, is to be at odds not only with religion, but with normal politics as well. So this is credit to Harold Pollack, who he referred me to this particular essay, and I later found out Harold also had Professor Sklar as a teacher when he was at Harvard as a student also. And so this is a piece from 2018, The Atlantic by Adam Sewer. Some of you may be familiar with this. If you haven't read it, it's well worth looking it up. It's entitled "The Cruelty is the Point." And what Sewer, the argument he makes in the paper is that in the United States, not only is cruelty tolerated, cruelty is celebrated. So you may be familiar with this particular example where President Trump was mocking a New York Times reporter who had the physical disability. Sewer gives examples too of like Border Patrol agents laughing as the families were sort of separated at the border, or as we've seen by the recent events in the past month with Paul Pelosi, that same thing applies today in terms of the cruelty being celebrated by some elements in the country. And I'd argue that cruelty exists in our healthcare systems, so that two-tiered, under-resourced healthcare systems that lead to health disparities for marginalized populations are cruel. And healthcare delivery and payment systems that are not designed to meet the medical and social needs of marginalized patients are cruel. And systems that accept the status quo and ignore racism and disparities are cruel. So to give you a specific example, Kim Singletary and I, we have a paper that will be coming out in January in the AMA Journal of Ethics entitled, "What Should Anti-Racist Payment Reform Look Like?" And one of the examples we use is the Medicaid program. That in 1965, when President Johnson worked with Congress to pass the Great Society programs and then Medicare and Medicaid, when he was negotiating with the Southern congressmen, the deal that was cut was that Medicare would be an all-federal program. Medicaid would be jointly run by the feds as well as the states. This would allow then some of the southern states then to maintain some of the control then over the African-American population. So when you look at these heat maps of like health disparities in the country and underfunding of Medicaid and where there's not expansion of the ACA, well, of course, then the southern states light up. So in some ways, when you talk about Medicaid reform, you really can't have that discussion without talking about some of the underlying sort of racist backgrounds, racist elements that have been basically baked into the Medicaid system. Cruel. I hadn't seen the African American Museum in Washington for a long time, and then I saw it for the first time maybe a couple of years ago. And in some ways, it's a reminder of what Dr. Sklar reminds us of, is that cruelty exists in the world. For me, one of the parts that really got me was about halfway through the exhibit. There's this wall which talks about the auction blocks, and there were a variety of quotes. Which and the one that I have up here is like when a mother's being separated from her child and the mother wailing and all. And so one thing I think that's quite incisive about Sklar is that she just cuts to the chase, the actuality of cruelty, thus eliminating any Machiavellian arguments or extenuating circumstances to excuse it. And again, it's just a reminder that just there's tremendous cruelty in the world and people are capable of just tremendous cruelty. So then this relation then to like liberalism and then laws and government, so liberalism, the rule of law and oppression. So it's pretty dense, so I'm going to read this to you this verbatim solely. That Dr. Sklar focused on how liberalism, a political philosophy based on individual freedom and government, could protect people from cruelty and injustice. The rule of law could help protect the marginalized, but she also recognized that legal actions sometimes ignored the plight of the oppressed. Professor Sklar was concerned with political injustice, both the active injustice of the evil citizen who does oppressive deeds and the passive injustice of the bad citizen who fails to act. Policies could defend against cruelty, but were dependent upon a vigilant citizenry to advocate for these. And again, what I find compelling is that she's not just sort of an abstract thinker that lives in her mind. That she grounded her work then again with her lived experience. Seeing the cruelty then of Nazism and Stalinism, and so applying these principles to the prevention of cruelty. The greater concern we think about today, to me, is that are those who deny then the inequities of the marginalized, racism, and other systems of oppression. And so we see this playing out across the country, essentially censorship. So many of you are familiar with these particular stories of the banning of books, so-called, labeled as critical theory, but not really critical theory. That basically is sort of whitewashing history in terms of the discussion of racism. Or the stories was that Tennessee, a local school board banned the book Mouse, which is a graphic, like a comic novel about the Holocaust, and saying, well, it had like violent imagery and all. To which the author responded, well, sorry, but the Holocaust was violent. So again, this attempt to basically censor. And so again, like Professor Sklar advocated for us as citizens to speak for the truth and against injustice, critical for combating leaders consumed with power and counteracting groups that oppressed marginalized populations. So I came across this essay by Toni Morrison, I believe it was 1995, which again is a very powerful essay worth reading. It's very short, it's like a couple of pages, where she made parallels between racism and fascism as tools to consolidate power, where she discusses that both of these different isms, they construct an internal enemy. They isolate and demonize the enemy. They enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonizing process. They criminalize the enemy, reward mindlessness and apathy with monumentalized entertainments and with little pleasures, and they maintain at all costs silence. Morrison writes, in 1995, and I would say in 2022 also, racism may wear a new dress, buy a new pair of boots, but neither it nor succubus twin fascism is new or can make anything new. It can only reproduce the environment that supports its own health, fear, denial, and an atmosphere in which its victims have lost the will to fight. Fascism talks ideology, but it is really just marketing for power. So, even as a sophomore, I realized that Judith Sklar was different, that there were a lot of good professors, but there were very few of the caliber of Sklar at Harvard. Just a brilliant woman, and her humaneness sort of shined through also. I was sort of intimidated as a sophomore. I asked a few questions in class, lecture class of 75. I think I met with her once during office hours, but I wish that, I'd gotten to know her better. And towards the end of his testimony to commemoration of Professor Sklar, Stanley Hoffman writes, but she was not only a bookworm, the exile or refugee, was a deeply worried citizen, and not merely a witness, but a restless, imaginative, and generous consciousness, as well as an unpretentious but demanding conscience. We need more Julia Sklars. Thanks. So I think Peter went maybe 2 minutes over, so I'll give myself 3 or 4 minutes for Q&A. Is there a way also that we access the Zoom? Okay, is that Preston? Right there. Yeah, so you may not be able to hear the question that Preston asked. Have I read Pedagogy of the Press by Paulo Freire? Parts of it. So Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it talks about this concept of critical consciousness. And I had this one slide about the need to think about the systems of oppression that are built into the way that we have set up a lot of our regulations, policies, operating systems. And so Freire argues that we need to consciously consider these aspects, as well as the relationships and dynamics of between people, in issues of hierarchy, privilege, and power.
And also our educational system to create educational processes of liberation rather than banking and the deposits of information in mind. I think Clark really liberated you in thinking.
Yeah, Preston also added that it's necessary not to be passive learners, but to really actively engage in the question and also reflecting on scholars' contribution in that area.
I think it's still reading.
Do we have like a microphone? I'm not sure if that's going to be able to record.
Yes, so we have microphones that are going to be right down on the first aisle that we can pass out to people if they have questions.
Okay.
So if you just raise your hand, then Beta, can you go ahead and like pass the microphones to people?
Okay.
And then this is also just an announcement for the people that are on the Zoom, but if you do have any questions for the speakers, enter them into the Q&A box, because right now I do see that there's one question, but others, please do that as well.
Yep. We'll go live. Yep.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm wondering if Professor Sklar or if you have any thoughts about the reciprocal of cruelty, which is kindness, and how we might think about promoting kindness, because it seems to me by just identifying and saying, you know, cruelty is something we need to work to eliminate, we're missing an opportunity to do the converse.
That's an interesting thought. Clearly, they're related. I'm not sure, but I would guess that she probably chose cruelty because it's like maybe the more clear-cut argument. And so if you're trying to come up with some type of like threshold or arbiter, maybe cleaner to deal with than kindness, which may be a more complicated construct. Maybe for the Zoom also, if you can mention like say name and then institution too, so we have that for the, I guess, the recordings. Yeah.
Hi, Debbie Stolberg, Family Medicine here in Chicago. Marshall, thank you for this. It really resonated and brought to mind that your point about, or Professor Sklar's point about the cruelty is the point has been on my mind a lot with our politics as well. And I wanted to share 2 examples of government exertion or use of cruelty where I think well, I'll share the examples and then a little reflection. I'm interested in your reflection. One is the threat by the state of Missouri to track down people who try to leave the state to get an abortion. So it's not enough that they, you know, are banning abortion within their state, but they're trying to limit people's travel. Very difficult to enforce, probably very clearly unconstitutional, but making that threat puts cruelty into the space and fear and intimidation and confusion. That's the purpose. The other is the governor of Texas using the playbook of ICE enforcement at the border to threaten family separation in families that affirm the gender of their transgender child and threatening to go after them using the child protection system, again, using well-known racist historical strategies as well. Again, probably quite hard to enforce, but the fear that stokes within families is the point.
Yeah, I agree with your comments, Debbie. I just maybe link it to like Peter's slide where he talked about like the vision of the MacLean Center and the multi-level vision. And maybe that's like part of the byline that it goes from like the moral discussion of evil down to then cruelty to then the individual stories. And so those individual stories, I'm sure, would have plenty of vivid human examples than of the cruelty. So I'm going to try to be a good example, and even though I know they have more questions, stick to my 5 minutes. As I understand, like Sheldon's talk, we didn't plan this, but there are going to be some parallels. And so I'm just briefly introducing Selvin Rogers, a trauma surgeon supreme, international expert. He's going to talk about striving for equity in trauma care.
So I have the task of actually staying on time, so I'm going to do my best to do that and leave hopefully 5 minutes or so for questions. Selvin Rogers, it's an honor to be here. I want to acknowledge about my chapstick. Dr. Siegler, who has been a leader in clinical medical ethics for decades, and I have had the pleasure of when I first joined University of Chicago a little under 6 years ago. He and Dr. Angelos came to my office, my makeshift office, and said, "Hey, we have this idea." That's not just what they said. They gave me a whole pitch about how we can use the legacy of the MacLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics related to the incipient standing up of Level 1 Trauma Center at the University of Chicago. I'm going to try to share a bit of a narrative that I hope is cohesive, but Dr. Chen and I never shared slides or ever had a conversation. I knew what his title was, but I didn't know who Judith Sklar was until today. But there are some interesting parallels, and ethics does not converge to a single pathway. So it's interesting that my remarks, I look forward to hearing what your questions are. So I have no disclosures. Any story about trauma in the city of Chicago has to start with Benji Wilson. You know, many people in the room may not know who Benji was, but let me tell you a short synopsis of Benji Wilson. Benji Wilson was the Michael Jordan of his time. So he was a prep star at Simeon Rice High School here in Chicago on the South Side. And he was a senior in high school, 17 years old, with an incredibly bright future in the NBA, in the league, as they say. And everyone was trying to vie for him to come to the university. Ohio State, University of Illinois, DePaul, all the powerhouses. And he left school midday to get a bite with his girlfriend and literally bumped into someone, but not bumped in that literal way, but bumped in a figurative way, but it bumped in a literal way, bumped someone. And normally that should lead to nothing other than, sorry, man, move on, right? Instead, escalated, and Benji was shot twice, once in the groin, once in the back. And he was transported to a small community hospital here on the South Side, where it took more than 4 hours for someone in hemorrhagic shock, actively dying, to get an operation. Got multiple units of blood and died the following day. That led to a series of policy changes, series of demonstrations, series of really impactful work, largely because of the influence of Benji Wilson. Apparently, you may notice the date, November '84. For those in Chicago, something else happened in Thanksgiving of '84, the death of Howard Washington. Benji's funeral rivaled Howard Washington's funeral in terms of the number of people who attended, how many people were connected to Benji Wilson. The big story here is that it led to a policy change for the Chicago Fire Department. If you're the most severely injured person, be it car accident, gunshot wound, stabbing, fall, you could not go to the nearest hospital anymore. You were taken to the nearest level 1, highest level, trauma center. Which brings me to this story. Damian Turner. So Damian Turner, another teenage activist here in the South Side, Most of his activism at the time centered around rent control, fair housing, social justice. As you know, this is 2010, August of 2010, and he was shot 4 blocks from here, where we are sitting right now. And he was transported, not to the University of Chicago Medicine, that does heart transplants and complex vascular and cancer care, was transported to Northwestern. Because back in 2010, back in 2000, back in 1990, back in 1989, since 1989, the University of Chicago Medicine was not an adult level 1 trauma center, and hence, by the Benji Wilson rule, had to be transported to the nearest adult level 1 trauma center, where he died. His mother the next day said, if Damien was taken to University of Chicago Medicine 4 blocks from where he was shot, he may have survived. She said he would have survived. You can debate that point from a autopsy clinical perspective, but the message was palpable. Something needed to be done. If you go a sub-level up, what did trauma care for adults look like on the south side of Chicago prior to May of 2018? These were all recorded shootings in the city of Chicago prior to 2017, with those little boxes. The red ones represent adult trauma centers, the yellow ones, pediatric trauma centers, and the ones with a red and a yellow triangle do both. And you can see there's a relative trauma desert, trauma hole, trauma donut hole on the south side of Chicago, here where we sit today, with a preponderance of gunshot wound injuries, firearm-related injuries, on the south and west sides of the city of Chicago. What is health equity? Marshall Chin summarized it well. I like this definition. I take it back. I love this definition by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Health equity, not a noun or a verb, but an achievement when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her or their full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. And I would posit that there's no equity, there's no access. Obviously, lots of different themes around that: Affordable Care Act, the access to health insurance in this country. It's not a right. In some ways, it's a privilege to have health insurance. And without health insurance, your access to healthcare is pretty significantly diminished, which brings up this issue of cruelty. Is that actually a thing that we should aspire to as a nation, as a people? Because of the lack of an adult level 1 trauma center after Damien Turner's death, murder, lots of activation of the community occurred. Some of it, the very groups that Damien Turner was a member of. Fearless, leading by the youth, Stop Southside Together, Organizing for Power, and many others, including University of Chicago students and high school students and people who live in the communities right around us. And that journey started intensely in August of 2010. And many years went by of sit-ins, protests, shutdowns, die-ins, live-ins, shutting down Michigan Avenue, all of which, humbly, I was oblivious to. In fact, I actually had never stopped to think that there was no adult level 1 trauma center at a place like the University of Chicago. It never crossed my mind. I had been to Chicago dozens of times for meetings, conferences, et cetera. I just had never been blessed to actually be on the University of Chicago's campus until I was being recruited. With that as a backdrop, the city of Chicago's infamous for homicides. Particularly in 2016, there were 764 homicides, striking number. So striking that in and of itself is a national story. Is it any more or any less of a national story than 437, 437, 506, 421, 416, 485? And in 2017, when I arrived, it was 645 that year, all in anticipation of University of Chicago Medicine standing up its level 1 trauma center. Right around us, violence is everywhere, but particularly right around where we sit. 1/3 of Chicago's homicides and violent crimes occur within 5 miles of us today. And the homicide rate in the 5-mile catchment area, except for the bubble of Hyde Park, gotta make that clear. Hyde Park looks very different than Inglewood, South Shore, Roseland, Austin. I mean, it's like its own fortress. But that's not the case for most of the South Side, certainly not most of the case of the West Side of the city of Chicago as well. And if you take trauma care, now this is related to specifically the issue of the most severely injured person, right? If you fall and you break your wrist, you can get in your car and drive to Wisconsin, or get on a plane and fly to Boston. You're not going to be markedly impacted by that. But if you're bleeding to death, or if you have a perforated colon from a stab wound or gunshot wound, minutes matter. And especially for those who are most severely injured, seconds matter. And everyone who drives around Chicago knows that getting from point A to point B is not a straight line, but also depending on traffic patterns, weather, lots of variables can take you a long time. So this is what, before May 1st of 2018, this is what distance traveled, depending on where you are in the city of Chicago, 77 neighborhoods. Green is good, short transport time. Red, blood, is bad, longer transport time. And you can see that disproportionately, the south side of the city of Chicago was a red zone. This is what things look like now with respect to distance needed to travel to be within an adult level 1 trauma center. Still some challenges south, way south, South Shore, et cetera. And also I will add some challenges in Northwest Indiana. About 10% of our trauma patients who are flown come from Gary, Hammond, Northwest Indiana. There's no level 1 trauma center. And there's actually only one level 2 to my knowledge in Northwest Indiana. So a significant number of our patients come from those communities. This was kind of my first job. It's actually my 21st job, but my first job here at the University of Chicago was to stand up a level 1 trauma center. It's a heavy lift for a place for 30 years had not done trauma care. And as I tried to tell pathology and urology and neurosurgery and emergency medicine and anesthesiology, and if I don't keep naming every group, environmental services and social work and the greeters, if I don't name everyone, someone's going to be offended. So I'm going to say what I learned in Texas, all y'all, which means all of you, which is pretty redundant, but everyone was impacted by standing up a level 1 trauma center. Some more than others, but everyone was impacted. Lots of need for a new emergency department, which happened in December of 17 in preparation for 18. Trauma bays, lots of people recruited, lots of people being trained, developing procedures that actually humbly lifted all boats. It was a tide that lifted all boats. It made the institution stronger, healthier, better, more efficient, and more to, unlike a business like a bank, Not that we weren't providing great care 24/7, but made the place truly 24/7 and truly 7 days a week, because I do my best work at night and on weekends, except in Chicago, where I do my best work every single day of the week, every hour of those days, irrespective of the sun being up or down, which is another striking difference about being here on the south side of Chicago as a trauma surgeon. This is a team. Trauma Center opened May 1st, 2018, and we've only been busy since then. And I'm going to transition and say we had incredible volume, more than I anticipated and more than anyone anticipated. We see about 5,000 trauma activations a year. And this is the thing that bothers me the most, 40% of them firearm related. The number one reason you come to the University of Chicago Medicine Trauma Center is that you've been a victim of gun violence. We talk about the fundamental principles of ethics. I don't need to belabor those, but there's equity in so many different dimensions. This is life expectancy between living in Streeterville, living in Washington Park, 16 years life expectancy gap, 7 miles, 8 miles, 7 stops in the L train. We talk a lot about social determinants of health. People still are trying to figure out what that means. How do you measure it? How do you impact it? But we know it matters. Dr. Peak will talk more about that. And I linger in this slide a little bit because so much about trauma focuses in the middle box, traumatic event, what happens to someone, where it happened, alive or dead, do they recover? But what about upstream, people's lived experiences in the built environment in which they live, work, play, and pray every day? And the built environment clearly matters tremendously. And how do we invest in the built environment to prevent the downstream effects of what happens? Very quick slides on economic hardship index. You know, red is bad again. Blood flows through our veins. South and west sides of the city, disproportionately impacted, especially for communities of color. Unemployment rate highest on the south sides of our city and some communities to the west, like in Austin. And graduation rates, there was a comment about high schools earlier today, and graduation rates of communities of color are disproportionately lower. That obviously impacts wealth creation. Unemployment and violent crime, if you overlap them, 2022, look exactly the same. So this is an issue of opportunity as well as crime. And I'm going to challenge that when you don't do a great job, even when people are injured, right? This analogy would be, you have a heart attack, we know you have diabetes, we know you have hypertension, we know you have risk factors for a subsequent heart attack, and we ignore all that and send you back and say, good luck. How do we actually address people who are victims of violence so that we can actually prevent recurrent violence or recidivism? Hospital-based violence intervention programs work, but are largely underfunded or unfunded. And here at the University of Chicago, we have stood up one that is continues to have impact. We'll try to measure that over time, but this is one of those things that we need more engagement across multiple dimensions to actually make a difference. The ecosystem is fractured and fragmented, and we really have to work hard to tie it all together. We have a lot of community partners, how all those partners work together to both prevent recurrent violence and also to deal with the social determinants of violence is ongoing work. And then I'm going to conclude with this slide, and I'm not going to read it because I think everyone in the room can read. I do think that we have incredible opportunity to work together to have impact in a national tragedy, which is the fact that we can't fix this problem. So thank you for your time. I may have 1 minute of questions. Question in the back. It's coming to you. It's right behind you.
Hi, I'm Alexia Torkey from Indiana, and something between that has been striking me when Marshall spoke that I think was really highlighted is that this idea of cruelty as the primary sin I think is intriguing, but I find a little bit problematic in that, and I wondered, and I'll tell you why, is that when the trauma center was shut down in the 80s, I doubt if everyone thought it was cruel. And when I came here in the mid 2000s, around the time I came, there was an article in JAMA written by a University of Chicago leader in which they said that we should spend less time taking care of the poor on the South Side and more time on cutting edge medicine. And I thought, what have I done? Picking up my bags from Grady and coming up here. But it turns out that there were a lot of people here who were absolutely committed to maintaining our care of the people around us. But the person who wrote that JAMA editorial, I don't think thought of himself as cruel, and many other people didn't, but rather just, it's not my job. And so I think my concern about the notion of cruelty as the primary sin is that most of us are more guilty of just the turning away from the pain that's all around us. And I just wonder if you could talk about how do we keep the focus on the pain that's all around us and turn towards alleviating it rather than just turning away and saying, I'm not being cruel, so it's not my problem.
It's a great question. It's a complicated response, and I could tell stories. I don't have enough time to tell stories. We have to be committed to think it's not a they problem. It's not a me problem. It's an us problem. So around the issue of cruelty, I do fear that if you make this about cruelty explicitly, it'll be like the argument people make around, well, I'm not racist. Well, I never said that you were racist. So how do you categorize yourself as such when that word never actually came out of my mouth? The challenge is it creates this binary situation instead of thinking about what are all the possibilities to make this better together versus the polarization that we see currently in our country, where we have far left and far right. Who's in the middle? And last time I checked, it's in the middle that we get solutions to complicated problems. I'm going to stop there and then we'll see what happens next.
Thanks very much, Selwyn. Our next speaker is Aseel Dalton from the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics. And Aseel will talk about embryonic stem cell research, advancing regulation to foster innovation. Aseel?
Morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Angelos and Dr. Siegler for, yes, of course. Thank you, Dr. Angelos and Dr. Siegler for the invitation to speak at this year's conference. So the focus of my research is basically was on establishing or proposing an embryonic stem cell research for the state of Kuwait, although some of the things might be relevant as well. I have no financial relationship to disclose. Human embryonic stem cell research is a relatively new field of medicine. It offers the premise of treating debilitating diseases. It uses contested cells as they present a conflict of religious and moral values. It generated heated debate regarding the boundaries of scientific research with some who are fearful about cloning. I will leave this slide on for a little bit just to present the views of the proponents of this type of research, either because they themselves have been inflicted with a debilitating disease or a loved one is. So what is so special about embryonic stem cells? They are considered blank cells, unspecialized. They're the original cells that have the potential to develop into specialized cell types that make up the human body through the process of differentiation. They are capable of dividing and renewing themselves for long periods of time through the process of proliferation and renewal. I will briefly talk about the three different types of stem cells, although the focus of this presentation is on the first type, which is the embryonic stem cells. The embryonic stem cells are derived from 5 to 14-day embryos obtained from the inner cell mass of the blastocyst. There are cells that can form any cell type over 200 types of cells. They have the ability to self-renew through the division with maintenance of their undifferentiated state. There's the second type is the adult stem cells. They are undifferentiated cells found among specialized or differentiated cells in the tissue or organs after birth. They make up the different body organs. They appear to have more restricted ability to produce different types and to self-renew. The third type is the induced pluripotent stem cells. They are derived from adult stem cells, although they're induced in a lab to bring them back to the stage of becoming similar to embryonic stem cells. So what are the sources of embryonic stem cells? The three different sources are either from leftover embryos from in vitro fertilization treatment, and we have to obtain the consent of the couple. We can also obtain them from spontaneously aborted fetuses or those aborted for legally acceptable cause with the permission of the parents. And the third type is from cloned embryos created through the technique called somatic cell nuclear transfer, also referred to as therapeutic cloning. What are the potential benefits of this type of research? So it would help with understanding of human development, identifying problems with differentiation processes leading to birth defects and cancer. It would help with the development of regenerative medicine to produce tissue organ to replace damaged tissues and organs and to recover lost function. These are the examples of some of the diseases that this type of research could offer a promising answer to. They have the potential to reverse disease by directing stem cells to differentiate into specialized types. And they will also help with drug testing potential by developing drugs through the process of assessing how they would perform in the human body by using embryonic stem cells. There are also some risks related to this type of research. Some of them are genetic mutations by applying genetic reprogramming, because we use viruses that can integrate into the cell genome, resulting in cells with multiple viral integration sites in the genome, tumorigenesis, high propensity to divide and unregulated growth resulting in tumor formation, as well as graft rejection. So we would have to use immunosuppressive drugs to prevent rejection. This is probably the most important slide of this presentation. So the ethical considerations surrounding this type of research is that it brings into conflict two moral principles: the duty to respect human life and the duty to reduce human suffering. The challenge lies in determining which of the two obligations ought to be given precedence over the other, and determining the specific point in the developmental life of an embryo at which it is considered to be human and worthy of full protection with the right to life. So to answer that question, we have to identify the moral status of the embryo. And in this slide, I will present the three different views with respect to the moral status of the embryo. The first view is the restrictive view, which considers the embryo to be equivalent to human life and worthy of full protection. This is the position adopted by the Catholic Church. The conservative view, also known as the gradual view, grants moral status to the embryo according to the various developmental stages. This is the position adopted by Judaism, the Church of England, and Islam. The liberal view considers the embryo to be a mere cluster of cells similar to any other cell found in the human body. And they basically argue that for a being to be destroyed, it should have interest that is defeated. And interest in this case means beliefs, desires, expectations, aims, and purposes. However, the embryo occupies a very unique position. It's an interesting entity as it occupies a middle position between a human being and non-human animals. The unique status prompts a tailored protection that would neither deny legal protection nor prevent any possible conflicts of rights between the embryo and its mother. So as part of my research, I have to look at different regulatory bodies internationally to see which of those actually offers a more sort of like stringent type of regulation, yet facilitative to advance this type of research. And the United Kingdom's Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority was a very good example. So the birth of the first IVF child in 1978 ranked a milestone achievement. and prompted the government to establish or propose a committee to address the legal and ethical issues surrounding such medical advancements. And in the process, they nominated a philosopher, Marianne Warren, who became the leader of this committee. And as part of their research or investigation, they decided to, the Warren Committee decided to adopt the conservative view and endorsed embryonic research. They believed that this position represents the most common view amongst bioethicists, physicians, and geneticists. It also is a compromise between respecting the human embryo while at the same time allowing this type of research to advance. They decided to go with what is called the 14-day rule. The embryo's special status was enshrined in legislation, and the morally significant point is up to the end of the 14-day post-fertilization. This point signifies the appearance of the primitive streak, which indicates the development of the neural system and the embryo's ability to feel pain. It also marks the beginning of development of the human embryo, as up to that point, twinning is possible, but it's after that point, the embryo becomes its unique individual. Prior to that point, the cells that make up the embryo are pluripotent and have not yet differentiated to establish the individual's unique characteristics. So why did I think that the Human Embryology and the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority is an example of a good governance? It is because it's the first statutory body of its type in the world exploring the potential of human embryo research and infertility treatments. It's an example of a flexible yet regulated governance model. It balances the ethics and science by representing the embryo's special status, which ensures ethical conduct while reassuring the public that the research is being conducted in a responsible manner. Why is it important for Kuwait to use this example? It's important to establish policy because it would address the entangled interactions between societal values and expectations and technological uncertainties. It encourages collaboration between scientists, religious jurists, policymakers, and the involvement of the public in the debate process, while using precise terminology to avoid any loopholes. It enables the adoption of permissive human embryonic stem cell research policies with stringent ethical oversight enforcement mechanisms. It ensures conformity in this type of research and the development of governance strategies for future medical technologies. It also guarantees an unimpeded scientific development to promote public health and achieve the social utility aim, while ensuring the people's safety. So what would a proposed policy look like for the state of Kuwait? Policy statements are important because it moves us from ethical vagueness into providing more clear facilitative environment to advance medical technologies. And so I had to use the Declaration on the Use of Scientific and Technological Progress in the Interest of Peace and the Benefit of Mankind. And the preamble of this declaration basically emphasizes the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, as well as using the model of the United Kingdom Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, while taking into consideration cultural and ethical norms. Adopting a conservative approach that is within the social and religious context of the society is very important. I also had to look at different biomedical advancement laws currently in existence in the state of Kuwait to sort of like address many of the ethical issues that have previously been dealt with to advance this type of research. And the current biomedical laws that I looked into are the organ donation law that address the using human tissues for research to save lives and ensures that the consent of the donor is obtained, abortion law that tackled the status of the embryo in Islam and addressed the case in which an abortion is considered legal, and finally, the assisted reproductive technology regulations that govern the practice of IVF that basically regulates creating embryos in vitro, the donation and storage of gametes and embryos, ensuring that the consent of the couple undergoing the treatment is obtained, as well as the fate of the leftover embryos. And so My recommendations at the end of my research were that it is morally defensible to use early embryos within the 14-day limit on the proviso that it is obtained only from leftover embryos of IVF procedures as a more conservative approach used for the sole purpose of developing therapies that are aimed to alleviate suffering. Ensuring the public that are engaged in as part of the debate to address any ethical applications of this type of research, to achieve consensus and moral compromise, make the research understandable and accessible to the wider community, establish a designated regulatory body that supervises all research activities involving human embryo to guarantee the safety of research subjects, to ensure that participants receive sufficient information regarding the risks of these interventions, as well as provide a realistic projection of the research outcomes when they provide their voluntary consent. So to conclude this presentation, I would argue that human embryonic stem cell research is legally acceptable and can be ethically justified on the ground of social utility, providing that it is stringently conducted in accordance with the law. Depriving ill people of the potential benefit of this type of research is unnecessary, and it would exacerbate the existing disparities in health. The risks of leaving this type of research unregulated could result in various complications, such as medical tourism with those who are well off, able to travel to less restrictive jurisdictions, the commercialization of human embryos, as well as the public engaging in uninformed and risky medical endeavors. Thank you for your time and attention.
Quick question for you. So in the US, at least at IVF centers, patients are offered, I think, 3 options. Number 1, they're able to dispose of supernumerary embryos. Number 2, they're able to donate supernumerary embryos to couples that may have infertility. Number 3, research. Is that an option in this paradigm?
It is unfortunately not an option in Kuwait because as part of the assisted reproductive technologies, the current law that exists in Kuwait and taking into consideration the cultural and religious restrictions, it is unethical to donate leftover embryos to other couple because that would constitute mixing of progeny. It is also unethical to store embryos, leftover embryos. So the only option is that they either have to destroy them immediately after the cycle is completed, the treatment cycle is completed, or you can approach them with the suggestion of donating them for research purposes.
I was intrigued by your slide that had like the simplification of like the 3 different perspectives, the prescriptive, the liberal, the conservative, and each religious tradition, of course, will have a spectrum across that. And so how, as you think about this, how do you intersect that heterogeneity within a given religious tradition and this application to the more universal general principles that
I think it's very important, and that's the whole point of the social utility aim, is that we need to move the discussions and engage the public as part of this discussion. And so if somebody who has been suffering from a debilitating disease, it's only fair for them to have that type of discussion with their faith leaders to decide whether this type of research is permissible within the teachings of their faith, as well as if they feel comfortable morally, either using their own genetic material or leftover embryos donated by other couple to sort of like move forward. I think depriving the people to be part of that discussion is immoral, as it should be up to them, as well as in consultation with their religious leaders and treating physicians to make up that final determination.
Preston Reynolds, can you talk about how health professionals in Kuwait approach patient interactions through a faith-based conversation in the way that their faith shapes a lot of their interactions and their counseling on patients relative to healthcare decision-making?
Thank you. Yes, so to facilitate this type of discussion, the government actually has a committee within the government that oversees such concerns, and they would provide their religious decrees with respect to opinions about certain medical advancements. And so subsequent to these discussions, the laws are promulgated. And once the laws are promulgated, these religious opinions are, for example, in the case of organ donation, the Society of Organ Donation in Kuwait actually publishes on their website all of these discussions and opinions to facilitate the discussions with the patients, between the doctors and the patients, as well as appease the anxieties of patients in case they have any doubts.
Any questions from chat?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cecile. Our next speaker is Michael Prochaska, Hospice and Assistant Director of MacLean Center in the University of Chicago. And Micah will talk about when guideline concordant and appropriate care is actually a disparity.
Thanks, Marshall, and thanks, Dr. Siegler, Dr. Angelos, for having me as well. So I have no disclosures except that I'm not a disparities researcher and I don't have expertise. So I'm actually kind of interested in the other people on this panel and those in the room providing me some feedback here. The work that I do is really in red blood cell transfusion and looking at the effect of these transfusions on patient-reported symptoms. And in that work, I have two papers or data from two papers that I'm going to show you today that I came across that sort of intrigued me with respect to disparities and how they may be contributing to some disparities. So these are the red blood cell transfusion guidelines for adult patients, adult hospitalized patients in 2012 and 2016. We're going to update these in 2023. But these guidelines both recommended that hospital providers only transfuse adult patients somewhere between a hemoglobin of 7 to 8. So for non-clinicians, this was actually a big change. We used to give blood at much higher hemoglobin levels, about 10 grams per deciliter. So that would be clinically significant difference. But at that old practice, in addition to providing transfusion around 10, there was a lot of discussion about the patient's symptoms or their comorbidities or why they were hospitalized, maybe where they were going to be discharged and whether a blood transfusion would help them. The problem with that practice really was that it wasn't very evidence-based. And so starting around 2000, there was a series of randomized trials, actually quite a few of them, all looking at giving blood at a higher or lower hemoglobin threshold and what that effect had on mortality alone. And the mortality part is important. And all of those trials showed no difference. So the guidelines appropriately sort of said to clinicians, hey, we probably are giving too much blood. And clinicians and health systems really adopted this actually quite rapidly. It became standard of care. It's really simple. You see this headline in the New England Journal from Paul and Jeff Carson, who are sort of the two internationally known transfusion trialists. And most busy clinicians are not getting into the nuances of the guidelines or even the nuances of this editorial. They see this and they say, oh, I guess I probably should reduce the amount of transfusion. There were some external forces. This was all happening. It's hard to imagine, but there actually wasn't an electronic health record when I first started as a resident at U of C in 2011. We were just instituting it, but there was this intense focus on the electronic health record, utilizing best practice alerts to standardize care. And what easier way to do that than an extremely simple clinical rule: don't give blood if the patient's hemoglobin is above 7. Quality and safety departments, at least from my perception, have grown significantly. Again, very easy to track this. So when you sort of think, well, what can we monitor from a quality and safety standpoint? This is one that's easy to figure out what patients are getting blood above 7 and which doctors are providing it. And then there's this argument in the literature, which I don't think is actually fully accurate, but the sense that if we just stop transfusing or using resources, we're actually going to save money. And so that argument has been made to hospital administrators who have sort of widely accepted to say, yeah, well, if we can save money, and it's evidence-based, we should follow it. So really intense pressure to sort of say, don't transfuse above 7 for all patients, standardize this care. The problem with this approach is that we sort of like took out other outcomes, right? Those trials were based on mortality. And so even though this standardized approach may have been on average good in all those trials, like we've sort of applied it broadly. We don't think about individual patients. All the considerations of the characteristics of a patient coming in are forgotten. We really make the transfusion decision based on hemoglobin only. And in fact, like we explicitly don't consider these things. It's not even that, well, maybe you can or you can't. Like now it's, you should not transfuse above 7 no matter what, regardless of these individual characteristics. So really, I sort of mentioned this, the work that I've been doing is thinking about, well, what are the effect of this practice change or restrictive transfusion on other outcomes? The outcomes I've been most interested in are fatigue and activity. Fatigue's the primary symptom of anemia. It results from low hemoglobin, and it's important because it increases sedentary behavior and decreases activity. These are major factors that result in hospital-associated disability. But for the purposes of this talk, one of the things that I started thinking about was, we know men and women have different hemoglobin levels. And if hemoglobin drives fatigue, which we also know, is using sort of this standardized approach to treat men and women the same, optimal for either sex. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner, this is a table from Butler and Whalen's blood paper, which those of you that are in this world know that's quite a well-known paper from 2006, where they use the NHANES and the Kaiser database to show that there's different normal hemoglobins in men and women. These are different than the ones that the WHO established back in the 60s, but things that I think medical students are still taught today. We have these different hemoglobin cutoffs. It's built into our electronic health record. There's actually also a wealth of data on how, depending on the sex of the donor and the recipient, you actually have different and incremental changes in hemoglobin concentration. And so again, I sort of thought, well, if males and females have different hemoglobin levels, and that results in different anemia-related fatigue, should we really be using the same approach to treat both of these, both men and women? So I did a prospective study here at University of Chicago using the University of Chicago Hospitalist Project. We enrolled any general medicine patient with a hemoglobin less than 10, and we measured self-reported fatigue during hospitalization using the FACIT-F instrument. You'll see on the top here, what we've done is stratify the fatigue levels by hemoglobin thresholds or hemoglobin strata, and lower scores are equated with higher fatigue. And so at every hemoglobin strata, women report higher amounts of anemia-related fatigue than men. And those are statistically significant except for the 7 to 7.9 threshold. And down below, we have a couple regression models. The top row, you see that women have higher baseline anemia-related fatigue levels than men. And as their hemoglobin drops, those increases in anemia-related fatigue actually are compounded. So that's that female times nadir hemoglobin line that you see and then the coefficient there. And if you stratify these models and you just look at anemia-related fatigue in men and women, there's a much stronger association between changes in hemoglobin and changes in fatigue in women than men. So females have clinically and statistically significant higher levels of anemia-related fatigue. The trials, which are well done and informed the guidelines, never looked at this. They didn't look at fatigue. They've actually not reported on sex differences. It's interesting. Some people might say, well, wouldn't females actually have less fatigue because they have a lower baseline hemoglobin than men? And that was sort of my initial thought too, but there's probably other factors. We've long known that genetic, biologic variables, metabolism, biochemistry, these affect our hemoglobin and response to transfusion. And so maybe there's issues there that weren't captured in the data. But for the point of today, like it's sort of, again, reinforced this idea that maybe a single policy is not the right thing for men or women. And so that's sort of like focusing on anemia, but I also told you, like, I really think about transfusion. And as I was doing a lot of this, I started to notice that there was some variation in transfusion practice by patient race. Very surprising, again, because there had been such an adoption of these restrictive transfusion guidelines and such belief that we really need to standardize care. And in even the institution and the electronic health record sort of saying care should be standardized. But as I noticed this variation, I decided like, maybe see what's going on here and see if I can figure this out. So same methods as in this previous study. Patients with sickle cell were included in the study, but excluded from the analysis. And then I did include Jehovah's Witness patients because there were 2% of them. Some of those included received transfusion, and not all of them were of a single race. And so this got published this summer in Transfusion, and it's actually pretty interesting findings. So overall, African Americans got less transfusion than whites or even other race. And what's really interesting is you start to get in the hemoglobin thresholds, and you'll see like 20% of African Americans that probably should have gotten transfusion at a hemoglobin less than 7 didn't. And this is at our institution. 14% of whites that probably should have gotten transfusion at a hemoglobin less than 7 didn't. And about 8% of other race. And those differences are statistically significant. What I think is often forgotten, though, is because there's such this intense focus on transfusion less than 7, and are we transfusing at 7? If you look at the 7 to 7.9 and the 8 to 8.9, you see whites are actually getting more transfusion than African Americans. And so the less than 7 group, the African Americans are under transfused. And if we believe the guidelines, and we think the guidelines are right, which I'm not sure they are, then the whites are getting over transfused at 7 to 7.9 and 8 to 8.9. Here's a regression model looking at some of those, or looking at the amount of transfusion that patients receive. And you'll see here there's also a clear disparity in that African Americans are actually getting less red blood cell transfusions than whites. They get less red blood cell transfusions than whites at lower hemoglobin levels. And that's actually worse in patients that come in with GI bleeding. So these differences meet the definition of a healthcare disparity. And in the context of restrictive transfusion, though, it gets a little bit weird because African Americans were under transfused and whites were over transfused. And again, if we think the guidelines are right, then we might just focus on the under transfusion. But if we don't think the guidelines are right, and we think that patients or that providers are giving transfusion to whites for reasons outside of the guidelines, then that represents over transfusion. And that actually makes the disparity worse than what we see in the 20% or the 15% that were not transfused less than 7. I submitted this to Transfusion. I actually felt like the reviewer's comments were so interesting. Reviewer 1 said, this is clear systemic racism and we'd like you to comment on that. And reviewers 2 said, I don't think your disparity lens is correct or helpful. This is just bad care and hospitals suck at giving medical care, right? And so, and honestly, the answer that I had to give was like, I have hypothesis, there's things I could think about, but I didn't have any data to sort of answer why the variation exists. I think there's questions of trust. There's patient preferences, there's providers, like things that I would love to study and understand, but I didn't have it in this data. The tension here, though, is that guidelines suggest this sort of uniform standard transfusion threshold, and its intention is to align and improve care and outcomes for all. For me, it always has raised this question, like, is that right? Is there a single approach to treating everyone? Is there an optimal approach in this case for treating anemia for all patients? And in study 1, I sort of see these guidelines may actually result in disparities. And in study 2, I sort of think like, if we just focus on that hemoglobin of 7 and whether or not patients under 7 are getting transfused, and we don't think about patients getting transfused over 7, like it actually may mask or make the disparities worse than we even realize. And of course, the title is tongue-in-cheek because the guidelines aren't to blame, and the committee is actually extremely thoughtful and smart people. But the way that I sort of pulled this together, and I put this quote up here, crucial ethical issues in clinical decisions, or crucial ethical issues arise in clinical decisions which at first sight appear to be the simplest and most straightforward. So we devise an extremely simple treatment for anemia, and we think it's easy, and we don't think about it anymore. And we algorithmically apply it, and we think we're doing it for the right reason, but we forgot to think about the risks, benefits, costs, and transfusion in individual patients. And so by removing patients, their clinical, their physiologic, their biological, their characteristics, their preferences, they're no longer part of the decision-making. Sort of assumes that the data that we have from trials, we can generalize to people outside of the context and values, both where the data was generated and where we're treating our patients. And that's true for both physicians and patients. And I think it's also allowed clinicians to sort of say, like, I don't have to think about this anymore. The computer tells me that I transfuse less than 7 and I'm just good. I don't have to even have the discussion with the patient because it's evidence-based. So standardizing clinical decisions to improve care can result in this sort of false assumption that doing that is optimal for all patients and will result in a disparity, or will result in parity. It assumes that if we use guidelines and data and those are neutral with respect to personal history, values, and beliefs, again, the result will be parity and optimal outcomes. And I think that's probably where conscious and unconscious bias come in, that we're not thinking about these things. And clearly we've then removed social determinants of health, which we all know affects the outcomes of our patients. So, I sort of thought that these two studies sort of represented paradoxically guidelines and evidence that were meant to standardize care, and in this instance may be a source or exacerbate disparities. Thank you very much, and happy to take any questions. Dr. Angelos, I think has,
I'm happy to speak up. So Micah, that was great. Thank you very much. I guess, as someone who's thought a lot about this, I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, it strikes me that every time guidelines are presented, all of the studies that assess how well do we follow the guidelines assume that the guidelines are good. And if you follow them, that's good. And if you don't, it's bad. But if that were the case, if everybody followed them, there would never be more guidelines.
Yeah.
Because we're all doing the right thing.
yeah,
But the fact that guidelines are constantly updated is because people don't follow the guidelines and gather data to show that. So I guess, it just seems like we're missing the point here by trying to standardize so many things.
yeah, I think that's true. I think the guidelines, so we're meeting 2 weeks to update these guidelines, and we had like a very brief call last week, and there was clear sense that people are dissatisfied with what the previous committees did, not because they were scientifically wrong, but because they didn't recognize the clinical implications. I may have even underplayed a little bit the slide talking about these external forces, like the electronic health record, the cost savings, the quality safety stuff that really sort of latched onto a headline that says, well, transfusion at 7 is the right thing, and we're going to make everybody do it, without actually digging into those guidelines and seeing the nuances. I think one thing that I'm not sure I have a great resolution in my own brain about is like how much to base guidelines on trial data, which is clearly the standard we should be applying, versus some of the emerging observational data, which has strong biologic, physiologic reasoning, also well done, and how much that should influence what guidelines committees say. Maybe not to endorse a certain recommendation, but to say the field is thinking about this. And so it's maybe not a recommendation, or maybe it's a low quality recommendation, but this should be something that clinicians think about. I think, sorry, Monica. Hi, Dr. Peak.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Dr. Peak.
Wonderful presentation. Super
Thanks.
exciting. Monica Peak here at the university. So one of the things that we always know is that guidelines are almost never immediately adopted, right? It always takes a long time. So to see a rapid adoption to me is almost a red flag.
Yeah.
And to see them adopted in a way that has racial variation is another red flag. And so what I think might be happening is that people are interpreting these guidelines with suspicion, which is what you're telling me. And they may be applying that suspicion heterogeneously across the patient population. So they may be saying, you know what, I'm not sure I believe these guidelines. And so I'll adhere to them when it's convenient for populations I may not be as invested in, ones that, whatever, let their implicit biases play out. But for patients who I'm super invested in, whose care I'm really going to make sure is the best, I'm going to make sure they still get transfused the way that I normally do. And so the guideline recommendations will lag for those patient populations as they normally do. We see a lag in guideline recommendations for years. And so I think some of that may be happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's the concern. And obviously I didn't have the data to figure that out. And it was really an exploratory analysis that I came across this, but that was obviously our concern as well.
I would strongly suggest that you do some qualitative work right now to try and sort this out, because these are the issues that frequently come up when there's innovation. There's the opportunity for disparities. And usually what we see is that people want the shiny bells and whistles, and the people with social capital snap that up. In this case, we have a shiny bell and whistle that nobody wants. And so we see the opposite population getting more of that. And so I think it's a great opportunity to use this as a paradox for what can happen when new technology, new guidelines are rolled out, and how just what can happen. And so I really would encourage you to follow this up.
Thank you for the comment.
Joe Howell, University of Michigan. I'd like to suggest we take a step back, maybe from 30,000 feet. And one of the problems here is that we fetishize numbers. We fetishize data. We made a choice as a medical profession some time ago to say that we like to quantitate things and we're going to value numbers over what patients have to tell us. And that's a choice that was made about a century ago. It's also a result of new technology, the ability to quickly and easily obtain a hemoglobin or a hematocrit. So that the structure is actually rooted very deeply in choices we made about the use of laboratories and about our belief in numbers and our belief that numbers are somehow superior to patients' feelings for decision-making.
Yeah, I'll just say I find it always amazing when the residents tell me on Tuesday that the hemoglobin is 7 and stable, and then tomorrow on Wednesday when it's 6.9 that the patient needs a transfusion. You know, Rogers.
Wonderful talk. I want to emphasize something that you did say, the issue of are whites getting more transfusions and are blacks getting less transfusions? The Goldilocks problem, is it too hot, too cold? What's the right amount? And I'm struck by the fact that if you think that there's a right number for an individual person based on physiology, circumstance, et cetera, we're getting this very wrong. And yet still, this is what we're teaching the next generation to do. So any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is really very peripheral to the central work. And the central work is that really the symptoms should be driving these decisions. And that includes measurement of symptoms, assessment of symptoms, looking at the need for response to transfusion. And that's individualized in patients, includes a measure of hemoglobin. But back to Dr. Howell's point, it's not based on this number alone. And I mean, just the idea that there's a single hemoglobin is really kind of doesn't make any clinical, biologic, physiologic sense. Yeah.
Hi, Tim Seeloff, Minneapolis. Do you have data to inform, or do you think that it was better before the guidelines, that people were healthier and better managed?
I'm sorry, we're gonna have to move on. So maybe that could be like during the break. Our next speaker is Andrew Pantel, who's a medical oncologist at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute at Harvard, and he'll speak on ethical considerations in remediating participatory disparities in clinical cancer research.
I am not as tall as Micah, so all right. So thanks very much, Peter and Mark, for inviting me. So I don't have any disclosures, and I wanted to start off with something a little bit different, since I do some qualitative research in that there's reflexivity statements, which are a practice where we kind of self-consciously critique our position, where we're coming from, and the fact that I do disparities research as part of my overall research portfolio, but that, you know, my background is that I'm a white, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied male who was raised not far from here, and that, you know, my background comes from medical ethics, like many of you, as well as from health services research and oncology, and that my exposure to disparities has not been a lifelong one, or one where I have been subject to discrimination in many of its forms. And so my work here, and obviously a lot of my early success, has benefited from this history of discrimination, from the systems of oppression. And so I find my work as part of my duty to kind of unfurl those. Thank you. And so what does representative research mean? Before we can talk about remediating anything, we need to really define where what our goal is, what our target is. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer for this question. But general thing that I always think about is, does who have the disease reflect who participates in the research? There's a lot of particulars for any, one study. If we're talking about a single center, trial, if we're talking about a globally enrolling trial, if we're talking about a biobank versus something interventional. But this definition helps us consider representation that's beyond a specific trial, meaning just kind of the portfolio of an entity. If it's a pharma company, if it's an institution, a cooperative group for cancer research, is it really enrolling and kind of reaching the population that it has the ability to reach? And most therapeutic interventional trials in cancer, especially those aimed towards FDA approval, are kind of centering around the idea of representation for national kind of participation in kind of the targeting of demographics across social and environmental determinants throughout, the U.S. population for things that are ostensibly trying to get approval to then, access the whole U.S. population for standard of care. And it can be a little bit different based on, specifics of that, but no, these are not pulling up the same. Okay, sorry. But in general, when I think about, first the definition, I always think about like, well, why is this representation essential? And at least in cancer research, we know that unrepresentative populations limit generalizability in almost every cancer, and pretty much every day you can find out why by reading most medical journals, and that there's mutational profiles, there's pharmacokinetics, and more importantly, because there's differential access to care that is demographically correlated and that is irrespective of disease risk. The second issue is that in drug development, we have demographically homogeneous biobanks, organoids, cell lines that we've been using for many years to conduct correlative studies. And these studies kind of nudge drug development towards the people who are included in them and not towards anybody else. And then third, the cancer research community has disease experts like some of yourselves in this room, running trials, recruiting patients to them, doing it at large academic centers like the one behind us. And collectively, this translates into high quality care that everybody should have equal access to. And so as our research community, meaning the cancer research community, in my sense, has this goal to advance scientific knowledge and help all people live longer, healthier lives, we have to take a step back and see that we have a lot of work to do. On the left, we have a graph of the race ethnic disparities for a number of clinical trials over 10 years that were going towards FDA approval. And these are breakdowns of incidence, mortality, and enrollment on the lines 1 through 3, with race ethnicities listed across the top. Just to say very briefly that you can see Black enrollment being about 1/8 of what it is by incidence, and Hispanic enrollment about half or somewhat less. And then on the right, age-based disparities also in that there's about a 6.5-year gap between the people who are diagnosed with cancer and then those who are included on the trials. And these are just two examples of many of the demographics and other social determinants in which there are disparities in cancer clinical trials. And so we have a lot of work to do. And many of you know these established ethical requirements for clinical research. This is not cancer specific, and this was written by Zeke Emanuel in 2000 in JAMA. And as a quick refresher, I think there's broad agreement that research should have social scientific value and validity, fair subject selection, favorable risk-benefit ratios, independent review, informed consent, and respect for potential enrolled subjects. But at the same time, do we think that this is enough? And these research requirements and a lot of research, especially in cancer care, has been done with the norm of justice as equality, considered requirements from the perspective of the individual study with some consideration for other studies going on at the time. But if we consider research and its risks and benefits across the population burdened by the disease, I'm left wondering with what these requirements are leaving out, if how they are described as sufficient, and if they adequately address health inequities more broadly. And by way of evidence that they haven't been doing so is a lot of what we still see today in the slides that I just showed you, which are within the past 5 years, showing that we still have quite enrollment is quite far from being equitable. And what's increasingly being considered necessary for ethical clinical research, from the perspective of the underrepresented groups that a lot of my research centers around, and that I've gone to talk to in terms of both communities and patient advocates for our clinical trials, are a lot of the concerns that you see here. And this kind of centers around the concept of the justice norm of equity, which both maintains a lot of the process focused requirements you saw on the last slide, but also demands representativeness as an outcome. And so kind of beyond fair subject selection for a trial, or excuse me, beyond fair subject selection for a trial, we have kind of the equitable distribution of trials themselves across a population. Whether we, come from this history of trying to get every drug to market as quick as possible and then saying, oh, we've gotten it to market quickly, we are now able to give it to more people broadly, versus what we're now thinking of as kind of fair enrollment on trials unto themselves, and whether or not those two things are actually mutually exclusive. And then things like the obligatory offer of compensation, where we have a history of thinking about compensation as coercion and coming from the standpoint of not offering people or not unburdening people of the risks, as well as just the fact that they need to get to the clinical trial daily and pay for parking and all those things. And also not even thinking about compensation with respect to the increasing cost of healthcare for people, especially those who have been marginalized. And then finally, something that has been happening more, but is still not in a state that I think a lot of the advocates that I've talked to think it should be, is community review and results dissemination of research. And so looking at some of these more closely, equitable trial distribution, rather than being limited to fair subject selection, considers, the portfolio of trials that exist across a geographic region for older adults versus younger populations, and then by a number of other demographics, racial, ethnic, sexual, socioeconomic groups, and then kind of all the intersections therein, which I think we'll hear more about a little bit with Monica in our next talk. And at the moment, this heterogeneous self-selective process among researchers or an institution or cooperative group happens such that we don't really have a good way to track where the gaps are between trials and which populations are not being reached. And the main level of regulation kind of happens also heterogeneously, in that you kind of have occasional calls for funding for things that have been underfunded, where you kind of have every 10-year retrospectives kind of looking back at how things need to shift, but it really leaves those huge gaps there for years. And one, kind of main thing that we've been looking at least in acute leukemia, which is the disease that I treat, is kind of the difference between where sites are enrolling and where the disease burden is by race and ethnicity, amongst other demographics. And so on the left, you can see the trial enrollment sites for those trials that led to FDA approval. And then you can see on the right, the blue dots are kind of the bigger the dot is, the more that that site enrolled. And then the gray are counties that minorities are of low proportion in, and then the green and the blue are the counties where African Americans in orange and Hispanics in green make up a large proportion of the population, and largely just to show how different the areas are between the blue dots and the green and the orange. And next, in terms of fair versus fast enrollment, we have this fast track being the one that I've mentioned that cancer research has been on for quite a while, in that we're trying to enroll as quickly as possible, apart from strict eligibility criteria, kind of irrespective of who is getting on the trial, as long as they meet those criteria. And the argument for this has long been that we do this quickly, drug will get approved and get out to the population. And I don't think it's an unreasonable stance, but it misses one, that most chemotherapeutics are approved at a single dose. That dose is usually optimized for the people who are on the trial, who often look like myself. But because of, as we know, variations in healthcare access, pharmacogenomics, things that Peter O'Donnell is doing here down the street, if we enroll homogeneously, we don't know safety or efficacy outside the group. And then crucially, we also don't know that fast enrollment is mutually exclusive with fair enrollment, in that if you support communities to access care and research, there's no reason not to include them and still get the drug to market quickly. And honestly, if you're including more people, you likely are including the population who is able to get on the trial and maybe enroll faster in the end. So I think it's kind of a false dichotomy that's been prevalent in my field for a while, and something we need to really readdress. And then we have the obligatory offer of compensation that I would like to see more and more. And historically, as I mentioned, kind of coercion concerns related to cancer research, and that we may be inordinately persuading vulnerable populations to be guinea pigs. But as the medical system has become more expensive, this concentration on overpayment has really left a lot of patients who want to participate and actively seek out participation unable to do so. And the fact that they don't have similar social support or financial support to be able to do so really makes the offer of compensation not one of coercion, but of engagement and true participation. And so this includes not only things like direct kind of travel and costs from the parking garage, but other things like caregiver burdens, as well as the assumption of risk. And then I think the question that I am more interested in bringing forward is also the one about compensatory equality versus equity, and that people are, no matter who they are, assuming some risk to be on a clinical trial. And I'm not saying that every oncology clinical trial is bringing forth a brand new drug that is always better and always going to improve lives, and therefore everybody should always be on a trial, irrespective of their own personal beliefs. My idea is more that for the people who are engaged and adequately informed and do want to participate, that those who are unable to do so because of the lack of compensation, because of the increased burdens, should be able to be compensated to a much greater degree than if somebody like me needed to be on a trial where I wouldn't be barred from being on it, due to not being compensated. And then finally, I don't know what those, somebody likes it. I like it. That's good. That's good. And then a little break from the doldrums. Finally, community review and results return and independent review has largely still remained within academic institutions, central IRBs, in this traditional bubble of academia and industry and regulation. And luckily, this has been changing more in the Alliance for Clinical Trials that I sit on a few committees for, which is a large national cooperative group for oncology. We do have patient advocates who are there at the stages of development and through trial writing and then in final approval of any concepts. But at the same time, even the patient advocates don't look like all the communities that we go to. And so just thinking about it, even within that sphere of people who are able to be patient advocates at the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology is much different than the communities that we're going into. And so thinking about it in a way where we are engaging in our local communities for the South Side of Chicago, for me and Dana-Farber, Roxbury, and the places that are right next door that are on our trials to much lower degree than the white populations from, let's say, Maine. We are currently kind of trying to create a system where we have those communities come in and work with us as we're writing the trial, not only think about eligibility criteria, but also kind of what can we do to lessen the burdens of the trial participation, as well as how do we actually communicate research results to you in a way that you feel like your participation and assumption of risk is validated in the long term. And so what I'm thinking about from the today to tomorrow is kind of this idea of moving from bench to bedside to cell to community, and that we have, I think, agreed upon ethical tenets that are process focused, but that somewhat don't meet the needs of the communities that we ask to participate in our research. And that if we can make these changes, like moving fair subject selection to fair subject selection and participatory opportunity, as well as including, burdens and community engaged review and return of results to communities, I think those are ways that we can really make research ethical in the largest sense. But I think there are still many outstanding questions, both within this and that, I've taken a lot of these ideas from the people who I've been trying to ask about research from perspectives that are not my own. And I think these are some of the other things that they have brought up. And I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on these too, in terms of what is good enough in terms of representation. We kind of run into power problems and number problems like we've just been talking about in the last talk, where you have a number of demographic and social determinant of health groups, and how are you meeting different bars of representation? What does that mean? What is good enough? And then also soft versus hard stops, and that the interventional work that we do can be a lot of education and compensation and different things that are getting over specific barriers. But what happens when those aren't enough and there are still gaps in terms of representation? And at that point, is there any ethical backing for doing things like quotas in clinical research to meet the representation goals. I tend to sway against that because of the fair subject selection arguments, but I think it's still an open question that really hasn't been adequately discussed in the literature. And then beyond this, also global equity, and that what I've been talking about is largely within the developed world and specifically within the United States and the regulatory realities that exist. But at the same time, we also have this larger kind of healthcare gap and healthcare equity gap between the US and the developed world and the developing world that this does not address. And kind of how do you talk about equity in clinical trial research and research representation while leaving that out? And that is definitely something that I have not adequately addressed, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts. So that's what I've got today, and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for this great talk. Would a change of terminology might be more helpful and ethical? Instead of saying coercion, would proposing compensation for loss of earning be more acceptable, considering that these people are taking time of their day and life to advance the ethical principle of solidarity, really, to advance research for the betterment of mankind? Would that be more acceptable, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think my use of the term coercion is kind of just that historic thought that providing compensation would have been coercive to people, especially those with less monetary or social means. I think it's just that we need to not use that term as much anymore. I think there probably is still a place for it in the lexicon of, saying, maybe, can I have your kidney for this research project if I give you a lot of money because you don't have it? I think that is coercive. So I think it's still needed, but I think it's a lot more about, yes, how are we doing this to support and to bring in people and to honestly just compensate them fairly for their participation in research. So I agree. I think, some of the language may be a little bit, I don't know if brazen is the right word, but at least, gets people's eyes open so we can talk about it more and realize where we've been coming from. Yeah. Oh, good. Hands. Anybody. I don't know who's a microphone. So sure.
Stacy Lindau,
Yeah.
OBGYN and medicine at the University of Chicago. Thank you for your talk. The reflexivity statement could be a whole lecture in itself, and
Mine's
very
still
interesting,
going.
but thank you for doing that. And I'm really interested if you are aware of cases where people who actually participate in the trials can have a role in the design, interpretation, dissemination of results. So we tend to choose from a representative community, but exclude the people who participate in the trial itself from those processes for scientific concerns. I don't know how valid those concerns are, but I do wonder whether you know of any examples where people who actually participate in the trial have a function, and whether you think that's feasible.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting question. I think from the perspective of scientific validity in terms of the community, I guess the needles and kind of the particular questions for any one specific trial kind of change so quickly for, let's say, a person with acute leukemia who's coming in our door who we're considering different trials for. The fact that they kind of open and close and kind of change so much in terms of making sure that the right people are even able to participate in the kind of trial concept and design is just, I think, very difficult from like an individual perspective. But I don't think it necessarily bars the specific community of patients who are at the institution at which the trial is being run from participating in some sense. I guess the question about whether or not they can participate in the sense of interpreting results and those kind of things is definitely one that I haven't explored as much. And I honestly haven't really heard about it from patients too much. I feel like their concerns are mainly about if the community that they feel like they come from to come into our institution is one that has a voice, and that they are assuming risk on kind of behalf of that community and saying that it's more that I want somebody who is in my sphere to be able to participate in the design and the interpretation and those kind of things. And I think from our standpoint, we have been bringing in some community advisory boards to kind of perform interim assessments of our research interpretation and everything before we have it go out to the scientific community. And so I think that's ways that it could be interjected, but I definitely haven't thought about it enough to give you a more coherent answer. So, oh, is that it? Okay.
So the last talk in this panel will be the intersection of gender and race, Black women and clinical ethics by Monica Peak, who is a general internist, associate director at the MacLean Center, and a newly elected member of the National Academy of Medicine.
Thank you so much. I meant to bring my phone up here for time reasons. I feel like. Okay, so I wanted to say a few things. First, even though we have a short panel, almost everyone has said, and Monica Peak is going to talk about that. I'm not covering all that. Although I will be talking about intersectionality. Second, I wanted to thank you again, Mark and Peter, for the invitation, to congratulate Mark again on all of your years of success and health and just the beauty of you and your wife, and just delighted to be here in person with friends and colleagues. And third, to acknowledge that I'm going to be, as per usual, diving straight into a challenging topic. And so just hoping that we can, even though many of us are virtual and that we're all wearing masks, sort of have a shared space of community and grace as we, over the next 10 minutes, tackle some tough issues. All right, and that you're patient with my technological ignorance. Like I have two things here. I'm not even sure what I'm supposed to be doing. Are these the same? Are they different? What am I doing here? Same, okay. That's gonna be something. And actually, you know what? Can you hand me my phone? I just feel better. I'd like to know how I'm doing. So I know that I think we're already over. Okay, so I always want to start by acknowledging the various places that I sit on campus. Obviously, the MacLean Center and also the Bucksbaum Institute for Clinical Excellence, was Dr. Siegler also runs. And I frequently like to, at least the last time I did, I'm going to do it again, I start with the definition of clinical medical ethics as a reminder, or just sort of a frame of how it's more broadly inclusive to some of the things that we're talking about today. So clinical medical ethics is a medical field that helps patients, families, and health professionals reach good clinical decisions by taking into account the medical details of the situation, the patient's personal preferences, values, socioeconomic considerations, and ethical concerns. It examines practical ethical concerns that arise routinely in encounters amongst patients' families, healthcare professionals, and healthcare institutions. And so the other thing that I like to start, and thank you for Peter for acknowledging that even though clinical medical ethics sort of starts at the bedside, it's embedded basically in society. So I usually like to start outside from a society starting point, and then work my way in, because this is where we live, work, and play sort of in our lives. And then we come into the healthcare system. And so I'm talking today about the intersection of race and gender. And this idea, this term of intersectionality, this is actually a slide of Marshall's that I stole. Thank you, Marshall. And it's a definition that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, talking about intersectionality, and it was really the idea of the intersectionality for Black women. But it's the combination of intersecting systems of oppression that perpetrate discrimination and disadvantage based on factors, social identities, such as race, class, sex, and gender identity. And so that's kind of a mouthful. And so we're going to just talk abstractly about it and then give some examples. Usually when I give these talks, I like to talk about structural inequities. But I'm going to use based on social identities, frequently or usually race and ethnicity. And today I'm going to be talking about, in addition, gender. I didn't, not necessarily gender identity, but it's on the same line, so I highlighted it. But today I'm going to be talking about how movements to push forward equity in both race and gender have affected people who sit at that intersection, particularly Black women. And so this is an image that sort of captures some of the essence of that. And so this is a film that was done in another country, but focused on the experience of Black women during the civil rights era. So it's Reflections Unheard, Black women in the civil rights, Black women in civil rights. And this is a quote sort of describing the film, is that it unearths the lesser known story of Black women's political marginalization between the male-dominated Black power movement and the predominantly white and middle-class feminist movement during the 1960s and 70s, as well as the resulting mobilization of Black and other women of color, and sort of they're banding together to sort of form their own voice. So let's first start with the idea of racism within an anti-sexism movement. And so that goes way back. And so one of the first pictures you'll see is the picture from the suffrage movement. And I think it says like headquarters for colored women voters. And so there's a lot of tension back then. And so I am a member of an all-Black sorority called Delta Sigma Theta, and we were very active in the women's suffrage movement. But during many of the marches, I say we like I was alive back then, but I was not. But women in my sorority were asked to march at the back of the line because Black women wanted to participate and were welcomed to participate, but quietly in the back, sort of in this segregated role. And so that was an issue of, like, how do we do this? This is a statue of Sojourner Truth, where she gave her famous speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851, where she made the case that about the important role of Black women in pursuing the justice, not just around race, but also around women's rights. And later, that speech 10 years later was sort of rewritten, rethought about by a white woman suffragette, and turned into like the Ain't I a Woman in speech. And that's probably not what she said. But anyway, the idea was that I am a woman also. Now, just because I have a different skin color does not mean that I don't have the right to be at the front of the line and talk about these women's voting rights issue just like you. Like, why can't my voice be just as important? This is Angela Davis. This is not the picture we normally see of her in the 60s with the big Black afro and the big hoop earrings, but she is still, speaking today about justice. This was in 2018 in Madrid, where she said the feminism will be anti-racist or it won't be. We're just going to have to decide. It's going to be this or it's not going to be that. And that, I think, is a critical issue that I think that's the crux of the issue. I'll come back to that in just a second. And most recently, it was this picture that said it's time for Me Too to address racially motivated harassment. And so many of the women's movements around voting, around sexual harassment, around just being a feminist and, reproductive rights have frequently marginalized Black women's experiences and their stories. And their ability to have the same equality in those experiences. And so that's been a challenge. Part of this idea of intersectionality is that are these intersecting axes of oppression. What does that mean? Part of what that means, and here's like the challenging part that I want us to all sort of listen with an open heart and lean into, is the idea that, you know, is it possible for feminism, as sort of largely populated by white women, to be as successful, as powerful, without its attachment to the patriarchy that oppresses people of color? That is to say, can white women be powerful without their whiteness? And if not, I think, you know, then that, I think that calls into question whether or not being an anti-racist, you know, what that means as far as being actively anti-racist, or, you know, passively not anti-race, you know, or, you know, some of the challenges that have happened between, you know, women of color and white women, and trying to sort of forge an alliance around women's rights historically, from way back when to the very present. And so I'm going to give, so that's sort of like an abstract. And then I'm going to give a couple of, one example from the very past, one example from the current day, which exemplifies this, this tension and this challenge. So we know the story of Emmett Till. For those who don't, I'm just going to briefly cover it. It's currently in a, coming out in a movie any day now. And so he was a boy here in Chicago who had cousins that were down south, I think in Mississippi. He went down to visit them for the summer, allegedly whistled at a white woman, and then was killed the next day. And his mother was a school teacher here in Chicago. And when she found, she was teaching our class, when she heard the news that her son had been brutally killed, and she broke down and cried. One of the boys that was in her classroom that she was teaching saw that. That little boy was the father of one of our faculty members. And he tells the story. So Dr. Ed McDonald, he's one of our gastroenterologists. You know, so that was not that long ago. That woman, before she died, admitted that she lied, that never happened. And one of the most common reasons for lynching, all the lynchings in the South, one of the most common reasons was fabricated stories about Black men making sexual advances to white women. And this is sort of has been detailed in NAACP, but one of the quotes was that, you know, white mobs often, now my eyes are all blurry with tears and can hardly read, used dubious criminal accusations to justify lynchings. A common claim to lynch a Black man was perceived sexual transgressions against white women. Charges of rape were routinely fabricated. These allegations were used to enforce segregation and to advance stereotypes of Black men and violent hypersexual aggressors. And so this was a commonplace occurrence. And this happened here in Chicago. Dr. McDonald, the one whose dad was there that room, he himself, just trying to navigate his way around Chicago, was almost killed by the police at least once or twice. I will say that I myself was pulled over by the police because I had expired tags on Lakeshore Drive, and I was almost shot and killed by the police. And so just, you know, just being a Black person in this city is a challenge. That's a bit of a sidebar. So we all know about the Coopers, unrelated, right? Christian Cooper, a bird watcher, Amy Cooper, a dog walker. Christian asks if she can leash her pet, which in the picture appears like maybe he needs to be leashed.
She tells him, I'm going to call the cops, which she did. She called 911 and tell them there's an American man threatening my life. And that's exactly what she did. And she knew that in our society, we value the lives of white women. And we really don't value the lives of Black men. And so she weaponized our institutions of our police system, because she knew what frequently happens when they show up and greet an unarmed Black man. And so his life was in danger. Thankfully, he wasn't harmed or killed or anything, but that story could have easily gone a different way. And so the ability for women to wield their personal power is in some degree a function of their ability to align themselves with institutions of power that they can call upon that are set up to marginalize entire groups based on their race. And so that begs that difficult question again about this intersection of race and gender and how Black women are often on the short end of the stick. So we're going to talk a bit, now we're going to sort of, with that in mind, talk a bit about discrimination and health outcomes. And so we think like, okay, this is what's happening in the world. Does that happen in healthcare systems? Yes. You know, I think about the healthcare system, it is transparent, it is porous. Everything that's on the outside comes in. Racism walks right in, sexism just walks right in. It's all here with us. And in particular, physician visits are ripe for discrimination. Despite the Hippocratic oaths that we take, we're more likely to engage in the use of implicit biases because of the circumstances of our work environment, where we have to use these sort of adaptive strategies with little information. We have a lot of time pressures. And so we have to sort of quickly make decisions about who people are without having all the facts, essentially. And those are high stakes decisions. And so this is one of the first studies that came out that was able to sort of look at what would happen in a high stakes decision, but it was really just a survey of cardiologists at a conference. They gave them pictures of different people, and the right answer was to send this person for a cardiac catheterization. Some of you may remember this landmark study. And so if you were African-American, you had 60% of the odds, or an odds ratio of 0.6, of being recommended for a cardiac catheterization. If you were a woman, you had 60% of the odds of being recommended for a cardiac catheterization. But if you were a Black woman, you had only 40% of the odds of being recommended for a cardiac catheterization. So it was one of the first studies sort of showing, because everything else was the same. Just like Micah was saying before, there are so many differences in, clinical presentation and people's comorbidities in real time, in the real world. In this case, there weren't. Everybody had the same EKG, they had the same echo findings, they had the same comorbidities because it was all made up. The only thing that was different was the picture that different people were given. And so there was a significant difference in the outcomes. This is a book called Invisible Visits, Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System. It was written by Tina Sachs, who is a postdoc fellow here at the University of Chicago in SSA. And so this is a quote from Amazon about her book. And it says, this book challenges the idea, am I like really loud? It sounds really loud. 2 minutes, what the hell? Okay. This book really challenges the idea that race and gender discrimination. So let me just say that the book challenges notions that this is a thing of the past, and basically, and it's only an issue for lower class African-American women, and that middle class African-American women are having to face these same challenges and have to sort of enact strategies in order to
get equal care, like get all fancy dressed up, wear expensive clothes, casually drop that they went to Harvard, do all these things so people will know that I'm one of you, treat me well. So anyway, so what that book is about. I'm going to skip this slide. Everyone remembers or should remember about Serena Williams, who had a blood clot. She had a pulmonary embolism, almost died. Her nurse said that she was crazy, because when she was complaining about her symptoms. This is, many of you may have heard about a physician, an internist who had COVID and was discharged home, where she died. And it made the news. And I have sort of a video clip about her. And I'm just going to show, but I'm not going to show because I ain't got time. This is the model about shared decision-making that I frequently show, that tells, it just reminds us how, as we're thinking about sharing with patients, sharing power and decisions with patients, how we should also be thinking about all of these other things around social identity, how in its shared decision-making has these 3 domains that map onto the SOAP note. But when we talk about patients, so talk about this 2 patients, we should be thinking about information sharing, deliberation, and decision-making. That Dr. Siegler's 4-box model, which we use as a case-based approach to ethical decision-making. There's a paper that's currently in press at the Journal of Clinical Ethics that's entitled Addressing Racism in Ethics Consultation, an expansion of the 4-box method. And so it's a way of thinking not just about contextual factors in the last box, but thinking about structural inequities with all kinds of social identities, not necessarily racism, but you can just say racism in each of these 4 boxes. And so that's going to be an interesting paper. And it's written by one of our ethics fellows. So it's coming out and I'm super excited. And then this is just a paper that was led by Dr. Monica Vela. I'm just reminding us that it's not just what we do here in healthcare systems, but we also have to think about strategies outside of the healthcare system to make them sustainable. I'll end with our definition of clinical medical ethics, and a shout out again and thank you for letting me stay here. And and that's it. Okay. Oh, and I'm going to get to ask Erin.
So I actually have a couple of announcements. After we're done answering questions, there'll be just a 30-minute sort of break for coffee and tea and pastries. And then after the second panel, the lunch will be cut slightly short. But we do actually have a virtual question from Shmuel Yerushalmi. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, but they're asking how, according to you, governments can support the reduction of social inequity and inequality, and what, according to you, do the authorities need to do for the improvement of accessibility of marginal populations to trauma care services?
To me?
Yeah, the question was for you, yes.
Oh, okay. So maybe I'll take the first one and defer trauma care to Solon because I'm not a trauma care person. Anyway, so I think that that's an excellent question because in lots of ways, because we got here by codifying all these isms into policies, procedures, norms, laws, right? Roe v. Wade, and now it's Dobbs. And so when we can codify them differently, then that goes a long way. Marshall talked about Medicaid. Medicaid was a concession to the southern states as a way to have them have more control over the healthcare services that were given to the poor, which are disproportionately racialized minority groups. And so I think that there's a lot that the federal government can do to rectify the situation. There is a paper that just came out in JAMA Network Open that looks at the role of reparations in what would happen if we actually thought about not just like slavery reparations, but like all of the things that happen every day, the things that happened through like the years of the GI Bill where, you know, you're supposed to have gotten access to free education and housing and Black people never got that because of racism. What if they actually got what they were supposed to have? Where would we be now? What would be the price tag for things like that, for policies that were enacted that actively locked people out, Black people out of what we should have had? What if we just, tried to undo those things and put things into place to try and justify that? That would have a direct impact on the health of people. And they actually were able to put a health to magnify the health benefit of that. And so that paper just came out in JAMA Network Open. So I think there's a lot that the government can do around policies to improve people's health and to reduce structural racism. And we know that structural and interpersonal racism are interactive. It's the people that put these policies into place. And it's the policies that sort of result in outcomes that shape people's perceptions about who people are. And then I'm going to wrap it, so no more. Okay. One live question. Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
I don't know if this is a question as much as maybe an observation. I think there's a recurring theme in a lot of the presentations that really touch on the fact that what we're seeing are the implications of structural violence, structural racism. And I don't know that it should necessarily be surprising to us that we see that the most marginalized of marginalized populations are being left out of transfusions. They're being left out of being CAFed. They're being left out of all of the things that we also see, I think, these broader communities being left out of at the social and political levels. And it was interesting to me that Dr. Rogers had mentioned Harold Washington, because his whole platform was, I just want to have services on the South Side or to Black communities and minority communities that everyone else gets on the North Side. And that was radical for Chicago. And I want to say that to this day, we still have not fulfilled his request. We still see a massive disparity in services that are accessible on the North Side and the complete lack of adequate schools, adequate social services from the city. We don't see grocery stores on the South Side. All these things I think that you're talking about that are all markers of structural violence. And so while we need to address them in healthcare, I think that what you said is exactly, correct, that they need to happen at the broader, really socio-political level. They need to, things like, missed opportunities from GI bills, educational deficits, all of these things. I mean, it's just this massive thrust that needs to happen. And it probably needs to start with us fulfilling the most basic equity and access to services across the city. And that's going to have to happen if we're going to start seeing all those other changes happen.
I agree.
Thanks very much, Monica. And maybe one more round of applause for all of our panelists on the first session. So we will take a half-hour break, and so we will reconvene at 11 o'clock Central Time, not 10:45, but 11 o'clock Central Time. sorry. I use this one. It's simpler.
The green button is forward.
I use the simple one, forward, back, but you gotta use the microphone because of the Zoom people.